On the morning of June 16, 2025, 3 days after the bombs stopped falling on Tehran, Iran's judiciary published 4 sentences. A man named Esmail Fakhri had been hanged. He had contacted 2 officers from Israeli intelligence. He had collected information on strategic sites and the locations of specific individuals. He had passed it through encrypted channels and received payment for doing so. The Supreme Court had reviewed the case. The sentence had been carried out. No photograph, no appeal pending, no family statement. What those 4 sentences did not say was that Fakhri had been arrested in December 2023, 18 months before the war. He was already in a cell when Israeli aircraft crossed into Iranian airspace on June 13. He was already convicted when Iran buried its generals in state funerals watched by hundreds of thousands in the streets of Tehran. He was already dead before most of the world had learned the names of the people the strikes had killed. He was the first name made public. He would not be the last. Over the 12 months that followed, Iran would announce the executions of at least 17 people on charges of cooperating with Israeli intelligence, a rolling campaign of public announcements, each formatted the same way, each landing in the same 4 or 5 sentences, each closing with the same phrase, "Legal procedures had been completed." The question every serious intelligence analyst began asking, quietly, in the kind of language that does not appear in press releases, was not whether Iran was executing alleged spies. The executions were documented fact. The question was something harder, and something the announcements were specifically designed not to answer. Did Iran know what it had caught? Israel did not announce the strikes. There was no ultimatum delivered through back channels that final night, no warning issued through a neutral government, no signal that could be read as a countdown. At some point in the early hours of June 13, 2025, while Tehran's streets were quiet, Israeli aircraft entered Iranian airspace and began hitting targets. What happened in the hours that followed was not a military operation in the conventional sense. It was the execution of an intelligence product years in the making. The first strikes hit the headquarters of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. They hit senior commanders in their private residences, not their offices, not their vehicles in transit, but the specific buildings where they slept. They hit nuclear facilities that Iran had spent decades and billions of dollars hardening against exactly this kind of attack. The Natanz Enrichment Complex, the Fordo facility buried inside a mountain, Isfahan, and they hit with an accuracy that within 48 hours had become the central, consuming question of every senior official left alive in Tehran. The confirmed dead from the opening hours read like a decapitation of Iran's national security structure. General Hossein Salami, commander-in-chief of the Irkeki, was killed on the first day. General Amir Ali Hajizadeh, who ran Iran's ballistic missile program, was killed. Major General Mohammad Bagheri was killed. Nuclear scientist Mohammad Mehdi Tehranki was killed. Faridun Abbasi Divani, who had survived a targeted assassination attempt in 2010, who had run Iran's atomic energy organization, who had spent 15 years believing he had outlasted the covert war, died in an airstrike on June 13, 2025, over the 12 days before a U.S.-brokered ceasefire ended the fighting. Israel struck more than 900 targets. Senior Israeli military officials later stated publicly that more than 30 Iranian security officials and 11 nuclear scientists had been killed, 8 nuclear-related facilities hit, and Iran's capacity to enrich uranium to weapons-grade levels neutralized for what one official called a prolonged period. Iran fired more than 550 ballistic missiles in response, and roughly 1,000 drones. Most were intercepted. Those that reached their targets killed 28 people in Israel. Iranian authorities confirmed 627 of their own dead. Amnesty International put the civilian toll above 1,100. But none of those numbers, not the missiles, not the dead, not the shattered enrichment infrastructure, were the number that drove what happened next. The number that mattered was harder to quantify. It was the gap between what a satellite can see and what a bomb can hit. Satellites can photograph a facility. They cannot tell you which building inside a compound a specific general sleeps in on a specific night. They cannot identify a scientist's car in a residential neighborhood at 5 in the morning. They cannot map the internal security arrangements of a nuclear committee that does not appear in any public record. That information requires a person. A person inside, someone who knows, who observes, who reports back through a channel that leaves no visible trace in a parking lot or a lobby. What the strikes communicated to Iran's intelligence services was not just that Israel had better aircraft or better missiles, it was that Israel had better information. Specific, current, human information. About people. About places. About the gap between where someone was supposed to be and where they actually were when the targeting coordinates were assigned. Iran's Iraq Intelligence Organization and the Ministry of Intelligence did not wait for the ceasefire to begin the investigation. By the time the guns fell silent on June 24, they had been working for 11 days. By the time Mizan announced the execution of Esmail Fakhri on June 16, the investigation was already running parallel to the war itself. And here is where the first unresolved risk becomes visible. An investigation conducted under those conditions, during active conflict, under political pressure from a leadership demanding accountability. In a country where the judiciary chief had publicly described the situation as an all-out war and called for speeding up heavy sentences, is not the same investigation as one conducted with time, with independent legal oversight, and with the institutional patience to distinguish between a trained intelligence asset and a person who once answered the wrong message on the wrong application. Speed and accuracy in counterintelligence are not the same thing. They are frequently opposites. The second unresolved risk is structural, and it traces back to how the network that enabled the strikes was almost certainly built. Iran's intelligence services understood, from more than a decade of experience hunting alleged Israeli assets, that Mossad does not recruit through one method. The elaborate safe house, the experienced handler, the years of careful cultivation, that model exists for high-value, long-term assets. But the peripheral network, the low-level informants asked to photograph a building, note a vehicle, confirm whether a specific person was still at a specific address, that network was built differently. It was built through encrypted messaging applications. It was built through cryptocurrency payments that crossed borders without triggering financial monitoring systems. It was built at a distance, at scale, and with a deliberate architecture of compartmentalization designed to ensure that if one element was exposed, the exposure stopped there. What that architecture means for an investigation is not comfortable to state plainly, but it must be stated. The people most likely to be caught are the people at the periphery. The ones whose communications were visible, whose payments were traceable, whose tasks were observable. The people who understood the architecture, who built it, who managed it, who decided what to target and how, were the ones least likely to appear in any file that a post-war crackdown could reach. Fakhri was in that file. He had been in it since December 2023. The surveillance thread that led to his arrest had been running before the war made it urgent. His devices had been forensically examined. His exchanges with Mossad handlers were documented. The evidence in his case, by the standards of what Iran's courts would accept, was real. But Fakhri was not the architecture. Fakhri was a node. And what no one in Tehran could yet answer, not on June 16, not on the morning his execution was announced in 4 sentences, was how many of the names that would follow were nodes, and how many were simply people who had been in the wrong place in someone's file when the pressure to produce results became impossible to resist. That question would not be answered by the executions. It would be obscured by them. What happens when a state that has just suffered its worst military blow in living memory begins hunting for the humans behind it, with speed, with fury, and with a judicial system designed to confirm rather than interrogate, is not a mystery. The record of what followed is documented, named, and public. What the record cannot tell you, with certainty, is which of those names deserve to be there. To understand what Iran was hunting, you first have to understand what Iran believed had been built inside its borders, and how long it had been building. The public narrative around Israeli intelligence operations inside Iran tends to collapse into a single image: the Mossad officer, the safe house, the carefully cultivated long-term asset. That image is not wrong. But it describes only one tier of what serious analysts had been tracking for years before June 2025. The tier that matters for what came after the strikes is a different one, and its architecture was not glamorous. It was, in the language of intelligence tradecraft, deliberately expendable. By the early 2020s, the documented pattern of Israeli recruitment inside Iran had shifted in a way that Western analysts noted and Iranian counterintelligence understood. Physical presence inside the country, always dangerous, always limited, was no longer the primary method for building the peripheral layer of a network. What replaced it was a phone, an encrypted messaging application, a contact that could be initiated from Tel Aviv, from Vienna, from anywhere with a signal, and that left no visible trace in any Iranian lobby, parking lot, or border crossing. The method worked because Iran had something Israel needed and Iran's own economic conditions made available: a large population of educated, technically skilled people, engineers, scientists, IT professionals, telecommunications workers, living under the compounding pressure of sanctions, inflation, and an economy that had been contracting for years. Not ideological converts. Not people who had decided to betray their country for a cause. People who had been approached, offered money, given a task that seemed small enough to be low risk, and who had made a calculation that turned out to be wrong. The payment mechanism was cryptocurrency. Bitcoin, typically, or other digital currencies that crossed borders without triggering the financial monitoring systems that would have flagged a wire transfer from a foreign account. For someone asked to photograph a specific building from a public street, or confirm whether a particular vehicle was still parked at a particular address on a particular morning, the amounts were not large. But they were reliable. And in sanctions-battered Iran, reliable foreign currency payment for what seemed like low-stakes observation had its own pull. The operational elegance of this model was also its central vulnerability, and it is that vulnerability that explains the speed with which Iran was able to move after June 13. Digital recruitment leaves digital records. Encrypted messaging applications are more secure than unencrypted ones, but they are not invisible to a state intelligence apparatus that is monitoring a suspect's device over an extended period. Cryptocurrency transactions are pseudonymous, not anonymous. A forensic examination of a device, conducted after an arrest, can reconstruct a communication history that the suspect believed had been erased. In the case of Esmail Fakhri, court documents described precisely this. Iranian intelligence monitored his communications, placed him under surveillance, apprehended him in a targeted security operation, then conducted a forensic examination of his electronic devices that recovered detailed exchanges with his handlers, specific instructions, confirmed task completions, records of payment. Fakhri had not been caught by accident. He had been caught at the end of a surveillance thread that had been running for an unknown period before the December 2023 arrest. The investigation was methodical, documented, and, by the standard of what his devices contained, evidentially grounded. But Fakhri's case established something beyond its own facts. It established a template. And templates, applied under pressure, at speed to a list of names that grew from dozens to hundreds in a matter of weeks, do not always produce the same quality of result they produced the first time. Here is what Iran's intelligence services knew with certainty by the end of June 2025. The network that enabled the strikes had not been built in a single layer. The peripheral tier, observable, digital, financially traceable, was real and partially recoverable. The operational core, the tier that selected targets, analyzed reporting, and coordinated with military planners, was not in any file that a compromised messaging application would unlock. What they also knew, though no official statement would acknowledge it, was that the political pressure coming from above the investigation was not calibrated to that distinction. Iran's judiciary chief had publicly called for the acceleration of heavy sentences, The leadership needed a visible accounting. The families of the dead generals and scientists needed a named cause for what had happened to their fathers and husbands and colleagues. The institutional pressure was not to be precise. It was to be fast, and to be public, and to produce names and numbers that matched the scale of the catastrophe. This is the environment Rusbeh-Vadi entered when he was arrested. He worked in what Mizan would later describe only as an important and sensitive organization. The specific institution was not named in any announcement. What the court documents alleged was a handler-asset relationship that was operational and sustained, recruited online, then taken to Vienna, Austria, where he met alleged Mossad officers on 5 separate occasions. 5 meetings in Vienna across an extended period implies scheduling, travel coordination, a relationship that was managed and ongoing. If the documented account of the Vienna meetings is accurate, Vadi was not a casual informant who answered a message and regretted it. He was a recruited and managed source, meeting his handlers in a neutral European capital the way a professional relationship requires. A relative later told Iran International a different version. Vadi, the relative said, confessed only after severe torture and threats made against his mother. The case, the relative said, was built on a televised confession. Iran International confirmed the account, but could not independently verify the torture allegations. Both accounts are in the public record. They cannot both be accurate. The gap between them is not a minor procedural question. It is the question of whether Rusbeh-Vadi was what Iran said he was, or whether he was a man who broke under a specific kind of pressure and said what the room needed him to say. That gap between the official account and the account that emerged from the people who knew the accused would appear again and again across the cases that followed. Not uniformly, not in every instance, but with enough consistency that human rights organizations including Amnesty International, Iran Human Rights, and the Hengal Organization for Human Rights began documenting it as a pattern rather than an exception. Iran's courts, for their part, were not designed to resolve that gap. The revolutionary court system, which handled espionage and national security cases, conducted its proceedings behind closed doors. Defendants were frequently denied access to independent legal representation. Evidence was not disclosed to defense counsel in a form that permitted meaningful challenge. Convictions relied on confessions in cases where the defendant had spent weeks or months in NERC intelligence detention before their first court appearance. The Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, Iran's nuclear establishment, was a particular focus of the investigation, for obvious reasons. The June 13 strikes had killed multiple nuclear scientists with precision that required knowing not just where they worked, but where they were at specific times. Someone inside that structure, or connected to it, had provided information that made that precision possible. By October 2025, that investigation had reached a nuclear engineer named Javad Naimi, who worked at Natanz. His execution was carried out in secrecy at Qom Central Prison. The Hengal organization reported he was subjected to torture and coerced confessions during interrogation. His burial took place under heavy security. His family received a warning before it. They were not to speak publicly about the case. They did not. What the investigation had not yet reached, what by the structural logic of how compartmentalized networks are built it could not reach through these methods, was the person or persons who had taken everything these peripheral assets observed and turned it into targeting coordinates for aircraft flying from 1,500 kilometers away. That person, if they existed, had not been in contact with anyone photographing a building in Urmia. They had not received cryptocurrency payments through an application that left forensic traces on a device. They operated at a level where the expendable tier was designed to absorb exactly the kind of investigation Iran was now running, at speed, at scale, under political pressure, in the direction of the visible. The pressure kept building. The announcements kept coming. And the question that the investigation's own architecture made it structurally unable to answer kept accumulating weight with every name announced in 4 sentences on a Monday morning. Was Iran catching the network? Or was it catching the part of the network that had been designed to be caught? Here is what is easy to forget. Because June 2025 was so loud and so total, Iran had been hunting alleged Mossad assets inside its borders for 15 years before that morning. And it had caught people before. And it had announced their convictions. And the program those convictions were meant to protect had been destroyed anyway. That fact does not appear in any of the post-war announcements from Iran. It does not appear in the judiciary chief's declarations about all-out war or the acceleration of heavy sentences. But it was present in every room where senior IRC intelligence officers sat down to review the post-June investigation. Because the people in those rooms had institutional memory. They knew what the earlier work had produced. They knew what it had failed to prevent. Starting in 2010, a series of Iranian nuclear scientists were killed in attacks that Tehran attributed to Israel, and that Israel, following its long-standing policy, neither confirmed nor denied. The method was not airstrikes. It was motorcycles, magnetic bombs, shootings in residential streets. Masoud Ali Mohammadi killed by a remote-controlled device. Majid Shahriari killed by a car bomb on his way to work. Dariush Rezanejad shot 5 times outside his home while his wife and daughter were beside him. His wife was also hit. She told investigators later that she ran after the shooter before realizing they were firing at her too. Faridun Abbasi survived that period. He was a specific target in 2010, wounded in an assassination attempt, and he lived. He continued working. He ran Iran's Atomic Energy Organization from 2011 to 2013. He remained inside the nuclear establishment for the years that followed. He was, by any measure, one of the men the covert campaign had tried and failed to kill. On June 13, 2025, an Israeli airstrike killed him. The arc from 2010 to 2025, survive the shadow war, die in the open one, is not biographical irony. It is a structural indictment of what 15 years of Iranian counterintelligence work did and did not accomplish. Because in 2011 and 2012, Iran did catch people. Iranian authorities arrested a number of individuals they accused of conducting the assassination campaign on behalf of Mossad. Those arrests were publicized. Those trials were held. Those convictions were used publicly as evidence that Iran's intelligence services were functional, that the network had been rolled up, that the infiltration had been addressed. And then the network, or whatever succeeded it, kept working. For another decade. Until it produced June 13. This is the assumption from Phase 1 that the historical record breaks cleanly in half, that catching peripheral assets and announcing their convictions constitutes dismantling a network. The 2011 and 2012 arrests established a template for what successful counterintelligence looked like inside Iran. Public, named, convicted, executed, or imprisoned. The template produced real results and genuine institutional confidence. It also produced a blind spot. The belief that visible action against the visible tier meant the invisible tier had been reached. It had not been reached in 2011. There is no analytical basis, from what is publicly known, to conclude it was reached in 2025 either. What senior Iranian intelligence officers privately understood, and what the post-war investigation's own internal logic revealed to anyone reading the arrest patterns carefully, was that the June 13 strikes had exposed something more uncomfortable than simple infiltration. They had exposed a persistent structural failure in Iran's ability to identify and neutralize the operational core of Israeli human intelligence networks operating inside the country. Not the peripheral assets. Not the cryptocurrency-paid informants with compromised devices. The people who built and managed those assets, who were never in any of the rooms that got searched. The hidden risk that the post-war investigation could not publicly acknowledge was this. If the June 13 strikes required the kind of sustained, high-quality human intelligence collection that analysts assessed they did, then the network that provided it was not gone. The arrests and executions of 2025 removed the peripheral tier. The operational core, by the structural logic of how such networks are built, remained intact. What happens to an investigation when the people running it understand this privately, but cannot acknowledge it publicly? Intelligence analysts and former practitioners who spoke to international media in the weeks and months after the ceasefire described, in the careful language of people who choose their words, a counterintelligence operation that was performing two functions simultaneously. One was genuine, identifying and prosecuting real assets, however low level, who had provided observable assistance to Israeli intelligence. The other was political, producing a volume and pace of convictions sufficient to meet the institutional demand for accountability from a leadership that had just watched its generals buried in the streets. Those two functions are not always compatible. When they conflict, when the genuine investigation produces a name that is ambiguous, evidentially thin, or that requires more time to build than the political timeline permits, the institutional pressure determines which function wins. The cases that followed Fakhri's execution increasingly showed the strain of that conflict. Not uniformly. The Ruzbeh Vadi case, with its documented Vienna meetings and alleged sustained handler-asset relationship, sits in a different evidentiary category than what came next. But by the time Akhil Keshavars was arrested in Urmia for photographing a building and accused of coordinating with Mossad via encrypted applications, the investigation had reached a point where the Kurdistan Human Rights Network documented a week of torture in an Irk intelligence detention center before his first court appearance. Human rights organizations said his conviction relied on confessions extracted under duress. He was 27 years old. He was an architecture student. Iran's judiciary said legal procedures had been completed. Inside the investigation itself, if the accounts from human rights organizations, defense attorneys where they existed, and family members who spoke at personal risk are taken seriously, there is evidence of something that experienced counterintelligence practitioners recognize as a specific operational pathology. It has a name in the literature. It is called mirror imaging failure. And it works like this. An investigation that has correctly identified the profile of a real asset, technically skilled, digitally recruited, cryptocurrency paid, working in or near a sensitive institution, begins applying that profile as a filter. Everyone who matches the filter becomes a suspect. Everyone who is a suspect and who, under sufficient pressure, produces a confession confirming the filter becomes a conviction. The filter validates itself. The investigation appears to be working because it keeps finding what it is looking for. What the filter cannot distinguish, and what no one inside the system has the institutional authority to question when the political pressure is running in one direction, is the difference between someone who matches the profile because they are a real asset and someone who matches the profile because they are a young technical professional in Iran in 2025, which describes a very large number of people. This is not a theory. It is a documented pattern in counterintelligence history, including Iran's own. The 2011 and 2012 arrests swept up individuals whose guilt was subsequently disputed by independent analysts and whose convictions did not, as the subsequent decade proved, accurately map the actual network. The same methodological pressure, applied at 3 times the speed and 10 times the scale, in the aftermath of the worst military loss Iran had suffered in a generation, was not likely to produce more precise results. What it was likely to produce, what the record of the 12 months after June 13 confirms it did produce, was a large number of executions, a smaller number of genuine asset neutralizations, and a remaining question that the executions themselves made harder rather than easier to answer. Because every execution that was not an actual Mossad asset was not just a human cost. It was an intelligence cost. Every person convicted on a coerced confession was a false positive that consumed investigative resources, closed a file that should have remained open, and allowed the genuine thread, if one existed in that case, to go cold. The investigation was catching something. The question that the pace, the political pressure, and the methodological pattern made it structurally difficult to answer was whether what it was catching was the network, or the shadow the network had learned to cast. That question had no clean answer in June 2025. It had no clean answer by June 2026. It may never have one. What it had, instead, was a growing list of names, and behind each name, a family that had been told not to speak. On July 23, 2011, Dariush Rasenejad left his home with his wife and daughter. They had just picked up the child from kindergarten. It was an ordinary afternoon in Tehran, the kind of day that does not feel like history until it becomes it. Two men on a motorcycle pulled alongside his car. One of them fired. Rasenejad was hit 5 times. His wife, Shohreh Pirani, got out of the car and ran after the shooter. She later told investigators, "I got off quickly and followed the shooter. After running several meters, I realized they were shooting at me. I fell down and heard the motorcycle go away." Rasenejad died. Pirani survived, wounded. Their daughter was in the car. He was 35 years old. Initial reports identified him as a physics professor whose area of expertise was neutron transport. Iranian authorities said he was linked to the nuclear program. An Israeli intelligence officer interviewed afterward by Der Spiegel described the attack as the first public operation by the new Mossad chief Tamir Pardo. Israel neither confirmed nor denied it, as it never does. What made the killing of Dariush Rasenejad significant was not its method. Motorcycles and magnetic bombs had become the signature of the campaign by 2011, but its precision. The attackers knew his route. They knew he would have his wife and child with him. They knew his schedule on a specific afternoon in a specific neighborhood of Tehran. That level of operational detail does not come from satellite imagery or signals interception. It comes from someone who knows the target's daily life. Someone close enough, or connected enough, to know that on that particular Tuesday, at that particular hour, Dariush Rasenejad would be in that car on that street. Someone inside. That inference was not lost on Iran's intelligence services in 2011. The campaign against its nuclear scientists, which killed Masoud Ali Mohammadi in January 2010, Majid Shahriari in November 2010, Rasenejad in July 2011, and others across the following years, was not just a series of assassinations. It was a series of intelligence failures. Each killing confirmed that the protective security around Iran's nuclear establishment had a penetration somewhere. Each motorcycle that appeared at exactly the right moment, at exactly the right location, was evidence of a source. In 2011 and 2012, Iran announced that it had found some of those sources. A number of Iranians were arrested and accused of conducting the assassination campaign on behalf of Mossad. The arrests were publicized. The message was deliberate: we found them. We caught them. The penetration has been sealed. Faridun Abbasi was watching all of this from inside the establishment. He had particular reason to watch carefully. In November 2010, the same week Majid Shahriari was killed, Abbasi himself had been targeted. A bomber attached a magnetic device to his car. It detonated. Abbasi survived. Accounts vary on the details of how he escaped the blast, but the outcome is documented. He was wounded. He lived. The attempt on his life, and Shahriari's death on the same day, sent an unmistakable message about the reach of the network targeting Iran's scientists. 2 men, 2 cars, the same morning. One died, one did not. Abbasi went on to head Iran's Atomic Energy Organization from 2011 to 2013, running the very program the assassinations were designed to disrupt. He remained a figure inside Iran's nuclear establishment for the years that followed his tenure. He was protected. He was watched over. He had survived the covert war, and survival in that context carries its own institutional weight, the sense that the worst has been weathered, that the threat has been understood and managed. He was killed on June 13, 2025 in an Israeli airstrike. The distance between November 2010 and June 2025 is 15 years. Across those 15 years, Iran's counterintelligence services arrested people, convicted people, and announced the dismantling of Israeli intelligence networks inside the country on multiple occasions. The protective security around senior nuclear scientists and RGC commanders was, by any observable measure, taken seriously. Movements were restricted. Residences were secured. Communication was monitored. None of it was sufficient. because the question was never whether Iran could protect its people from a man on a motorcycle. The question was whether it could protect them from an aircraft that had been given their exact location by someone the protective security had never identified. Here is what the 15-year arc from 2010 to 2025 reveals about the nature of the penetration Iran was dealing with, and why the post-June crackdown was, from the beginning, running against a structural problem it could not solve through speed or scale. The 2010 to 2012 killings required current, specific, operational intelligence. They required someone who knew schedules, routes, and the small daily patterns that make a person findable at a specific moment. That kind of intelligence decays quickly. It requires an asset who is active, proximate, and regularly reporting. The arrests of 2011 and 2012 removed some of those assets. The killings slowed, then effectively stopped for several years, which Iran's counterintelligence interpreted, reasonably, as evidence that the network had been disrupted. What the slowdown actually reflected is more ambiguous. It may have reflected genuine disruption. It may have reflected a deliberate operational pause, a decision by Israeli intelligence to go quiet, preserve remaining assets, and shift collection toward longer-term strategic targets rather than individual scientists whose deaths had begun attracting unwanted international attention. The two explanations are not distinguishable from the outside. Iran's intelligence services, having arrested people and announced success, had institutional reasons to prefer the first interpretation. The June 2025 strikes suggest the second interpretation was closer to accurate, because the intelligence that enabled those strikes was not the intelligence of a network that had been rebuilt from scratch after 2012. The targeting of specific commanders in specific residences, of scientists in locations that required sustained monitoring over time, of nuclear facilities with the internal knowledge of what was inside hardened structures, that picture was assembled over years. It was assembled by sources who were patient, who were compartmentalized, who were managed by handlers sophisticated enough to survive the 2011 and 2012 arrests without being traced through them. The arrests of that earlier period caught the visible layer. They always catch the visible layer. The layer that survives is the one that was designed to be invisible, not to individual investigators, but to the investigation as a system. Dariush Rasenajat's wife ran after the motorcycle. She was shot at. She survived. She gave her account to investigators, and it became part of the public record. 14 years later, the program that her husband's death was meant to disrupt was destroyed in 12 days by aircraft that had better information than any motorcycle-riding assassin could ever carry. What that continuity means for the 2025 crackdown is not comforting. It means the crackdown was not operating against a network that had been newly constructed in the years before June 2025. It was operating against the mature, patient, surviving remnant of something that had been building for at least 15 years, something that had already survived one round of Iranian counterintelligence, adapted, went quiet, and then produced the most precise targeting package in the history of the Iran-Israel conflict. The arrests of 2025 were more numerous than those of 2011 and 2012. The executions were faster, the political mandate was louder, and the structural problem was identical. The investigation could reach the peripheral layer, document its communications, produce its confessions, and announce its convictions. It could not, by the methods it was using, reach the layer that mattered. Faridun Abbasi survived the motorcycle. He did not survive the aircraft. The difference between those two facts is not a story about improved Israeli military capability. It is a story about what 15 years of undetected intelligence collection looks like when it finally becomes visible. And in Tehran, in the months after June 2025, Iran's investigators were looking at the visible end of something whose other end they had never found, and were running out of time, and patience, and perhaps the institutional willingness to admit it. By the autumn of 2025, the executions had acquired a rhythm. An announcement would appear on Mizan, the judiciary's official outlet. A name, a charge. A summary of the accused's crimes, written in the passive voice of institutional certainty. He had contacted Mossad officers. He had collected information. He had passed it through encrypted channels, he had received payment, he had confessed. The Supreme Court had reviewed the case. The sentence had been carried out. Then, days or weeks later, another announcement. Another name. Another 4 sentences. The rhythm communicated something deliberate. This was not a single operation concluding. It was a system in continuous operation, methodical, sequential, unhurried in its public face even as the pace behind it was anything but. Iran was not announcing a purge, it was announcing a process. And processes, by their nature, imply that more names are coming. For anyone inside Iran who had ever answered an unexpected message on an encrypted application, the rhythm was the message. The method Iran's intelligence services used to build espionage cases in the post-June period was, in its broad structure, the same method that had produced the Fakhri case before the war: extended digital surveillance, forensic device examination, interrogation, confession, revolutionary court, Supreme Court review, execution. Each step generated a document. Each document became evidence of the step that followed. The system was self-reinforcing by design, not because it was corrupt in every instance, but because it was structured in a way that made the production of confessions the central evidentiary event, and then treated the confession as sufficient to close every question the confession had been asked to answer. The interrogation environment that produced those confessions is documented not through speculation, but through the accumulated testimony of defendants, family members, and human rights organizations across multiple cases. The Hanga Organization for Human Rights, the Kurdistan Human Rights Network, Iran Human Rights, and Amnesty International each documented, independently and in overlapping cases, a consistent pattern. Solitary confinement in Iraq intelligence detention facilities, sometimes for weeks before a defendant's first contact with legal counsel. Physical pressure during interrogation sessions. Threats directed not at the defendant but at their family, a specific technique, documented in multiple cases, that applies leverage without leaving marks. Televised confessions recorded before trial, in conditions that defense attorneys, where they existed, were not permitted to observe or challenge. In the case of Rusbeh Vadi, a relative described threats made against his mother. In the case of Babak Shabazi, Amnesty International documented months without lawyer access and prolonged solitary confinement. In the case of Javad Naimi, the Hanga organization reported coerced confessions and a burial conducted under heavy security with the family explicitly warned to stay silent. In the case of Aghil Keshavars, the Kurdistan Human Rights Network documented a week of torture in an Irk detention center before transfer to Evin prison. These are not allegations from a single source with a single institutional interest. They come from multiple independent organizations across multiple cases over a period of months. The pattern they describe is not incidental to the method. It is the method. And here is where the mid-script reframe becomes unavoidable, where the framework that has governed the narration to this point requires a fundamental adjustment. The working assumption embedded in the title of this documentary and in the post-war narrative Iran constructed through its Mossad announcements is that Iran was hunting Mossad's agents, identifying them, catching them, executing them, that the people named in those 4-sentence announcements were the people behind the intelligence that enabled the June 13 strikes. That assumption is not simply unverified. It is, by the documented logic of how the investigation was conducted, structurally unreliable. A confession extracted through prolonged solitary confinement, physical pressure, and threats against a defendant's family is not evidence of guilt. It is evidence of the effectiveness of solitary confinement, physical pressure, and threats against a family. Those are not the same thing, and no serious intelligence service, including Iran's own, when it is operating carefully rather than under political mandate, treats coerced confession as a reliable guide to what actually happened. What a coerced confession reliably produces is a name, a charge, and a narrative that matches the profile the investigators brought into the interrogation room. If the investigator believes the defendant contacted Mossad, the confession will confirm that the defendant contacted Mossad. If the investigator believes the defendant photographed specific sites, the confession will identify specific sites. The confession does not discover the truth of what the defendant did. It reflects the shape of what the investigator already believed, run through a human being under conditions that make agreement the only survivable option. This is the reframe. Not that the crackdown was entirely fabricated. The evidence in some cases, Fekri's documented device forensics, Vadi's alleged Vienna meetings, Chubiasel's telecommunications access, suggests real intelligence work with real evidentiary grounding. Some of the people Iran executed in the months after June 2025 almost certainly had genuine contact with Israeli intelligence services. But the system that processed those cases could not distinguish between the genuinely recruited asset and the person who broke under pressure and confirmed whatever the room required. It was not designed to make that distinction. It was designed to produce convictions at a pace that satisfied a political mandate, using a confessional method that guaranteed a conviction rate of 100% regardless of the underlying factual reality. The central thesis of what follows is this: Iran's post-June crackdown was not a counterintelligence operation that happened to use execution as its endpoint. It was a demonstration of state power that used the form of a counterintelligence operation to justify execution as a political instrument. Those two things can overlap. Some of the executed may have been both genuine assets and victims of a politically driven process, but they are not the same thing. And the conflation of those two things, sustained by 4-sentence announcements from Mizan over 12 months, is itself an act of institutional intelligence, Iran telling a story about its own capability that the story's own evidence does not fully support. The operational core of what enabled June 13 was not reached by this method. Could not have been reached by this method. A network sophisticated enough to sustain 15 years of collection, survive the 2011 and 2012 arrests, and produce the targeting precision of June 13 was not going to be dismantled by an investigation that worked by arresting the digitally visible, applying pressure until confession, and then announcing completion. What the investigation reached was the expendable tier, the peripheral layer designed, in the architecture of any serious network, to absorb exactly this kind of operation. Some of those people were real, some were not. The system processing them was incapable of telling the difference reliably, and the political pressure running through it ensured that the incapability would never be publicly acknowledged. And then there is the case that makes this reframe not an analytical abstraction, but a human fact. Mehdi Farid worked at the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran. He was, according to Iranian court documents, connected to a defense management committee at a sensitive institution. He was accused of sharing organizational structures, security arrangements, and infrastructure data with Mossad, of connecting internal servers to infected files, of enabling outside access to systems using USB devices. He was initially sentenced to 10 years. The prosecutor objected. The sentence was changed to death. The civil society organization Hengaw, citing an informed source, provided a different account. Farid, according to that account, had been approached by individuals attributed to Israeli intelligence. He was asked to act against nuclear scientists. He refused. He then went voluntarily to the security office of the Atomic Energy Agency and reported the approach, handing over the information and the payments he had received from the contact. If Hengaw's account is accurate, Mehdi Farid did exactly what the Iranian state would want a loyal employee to do when approached by a foreign intelligence service. He reported it. He was executed for it. The investigation was now committed to a method that could not correct for its own errors. The confessions were on record. The Supreme Court reviews had been completed. The sentences had been carried out. There was no mechanism inside the system, no appeal process, no independent review. No institutional authority with both the standing and the will to examine whether the confession that closed each file reflected what had actually happened, that could reach back into a completed case and say, "We may have been wrong." The machine was running. And the machine, by design, could not stop itself. The announcements kept coming. September 29, 2025, Bahman Chubiesel. Executed, one of the most important spies for Israel in Iran, Mossad said. Telecommunications work, sensitive projects, database access. Mossad's goal had been the governmental data infrastructure itself, not a location, not a scientist's schedule, but the architecture of Iranian state communications. 4 sentences, legal procedures completed. October 2025, Javad Naimi, Natanz, executed in secrecy, no announcement for days. When Hengal confirmed it, the judiciary's response was silence. His family had already been warned. The pace was not slowing, it was holding. Deliberate, one name, then a pause, then another name, each announcement formatted identically, each using the same passive construction, each closing the same way. Inside IRC intelligence facilities, the investigation had found its operational tempo. Files were moving, cases were completing. The system was producing output at exactly the rate the political mandate required. And this is where the first false start becomes visible. In the early phase of the post-war arrests, Iranian intelligence had operated on an assumption that seemed reasonable given everything the June 13 strikes had demonstrated. The assumption was directional. The assets most worth finding were the ones with access to the targets that had been hit. Commanders, scientists, facility layouts. The investigation oriented toward people with documented proximity to the dead, people who had worked alongside the generals, people inside the nuclear establishment, people whose institutional position could plausibly explain the precision of what Israel had known. It was a logical filter. It was also, in a specific and consequential way, wrong, the assets with genuine access to that quality of intelligence. The ones who had sustained proximity to senior commanders and nuclear scientists over years were exactly the assets a professional network would have insulated most carefully. They were the ones with the cleanest digital profile. No encrypted app conversations recoverable from a device. No cryptocurrency transactions traceable to a foreign account. No foreign travel pattern that triggered monitoring. They were the ones whose communications, if they existed at all in digital form, were managed by handlers sophisticated enough to ensure that a forensic examination of any device would find nothing. The investigation's filter was pointed at the right institutional territory. It was using the wrong instrument to search it. What the instrument, device forensics, digital surveillance, interrogation, confession, reliably found was a different population. Younger, less senior. Technically skilled but not institutionally embedded at the level that produces targeting coordinates for aircraft. People who had been recruited through the same encrypted app, cryptocurrency payment method that left exactly the kind of digital trace the investigation was equipped to find. They were real. Some of them. And they were findable. And finding them produced convictions, and convictions produced announcements. And announcements produced the appearance of a functioning counterintelligence operation neutralizing the network that had enabled the strikes. The appearance was not entirely false. It was incomplete in a way that the system had no mechanism to detect. Then came the near abort. It did not come from inside the investigation. It came from outside. By late autumn 2025, the international condemnations had accumulated to a volume that created a specific kind of institutional pressure, not the pressure of accountability, but the pressure of visibility. Amnesty International had publicly called for an immediate halt to the executions. The UN Human Rights Office had issued a statement describing a systematic pattern of using the death penalty as a tool of state intimidation. Western governments had issued formal condemnations. The cases of Keshawars and Shahbazi in particular. A 27-year-old architecture student and a man whose rights organization said had first written to a foreign head of state rather than any intelligence service, had attracted attention that made the standard Mizan announcement feel, to outside observers increasingly difficult to credit. Inside Iran, there was a moment. Brief, visible only in retrospect through the slight deceleration in announcement pace through October and into early November. A gap between names that was longer than the rhythm had established. It might have been administrative. It might have been the Supreme Court review process running slower on a backlog of cases. It might have been something else, a conversation inside the judiciary, or between the judiciary and the intelligence services about whether the pace and the public profile of what they were doing was producing the intended signal or a different one. If that conversation happened, it did not produce a halt. It produced a resumption. November-December, the announcements returned to their established rhythm. December 20th, 2025. Akil Keshavars, executed at Urmia Central Prison. The day before, his family had been permitted a final visit. They knew. Student groups had been issuing warnings for hours. He had been moved to solitary confinement, the recognized signal inside Iran's prison system that a sentence is about to be carried out. The execution came the next morning. Mizan's announcement described him as an agent of Mossad and the Israeli military. It listed his charges: espionage, intelligence cooperation, photographing military and security sites. It noted that legal procedures had been completed. The Kurdistan Human Rights Network's account described a week of torture in an Irk detention center before his first court appearance. Iran Human Rights said his conviction relied on confessions extracted under duress. He was 27 years old. He was an architecture student. The false release moment came in early January 2026. Senior Iranian officials, speaking in terms that state media amplified, suggested that the major phase of the counterintelligence operation was approaching completion. The network had been substantially dismantled. The key nodes had been identified and neutralized. The investigation had done what it was designed to do. Iran had demonstrated that no level of Israeli infiltration would go unanswered, and that the answer would be swift, public, and terminal. It was the kind of statement that in intelligence work signals one of two things: genuine operational conclusion, or the end of what the investigation could find using the methods it had. Then, January 7th, 2026, Ali Ardestani. Executed, recruited online. Tasks completed in exchange for payment and promises, financial rewards, the prospect of a British visa, the possibility of $1 million payout he never received, accused of collecting images of specific locations and individuals, in-person contacts with intermediaries inside Iran. Supreme Court upheld. Sentence carried out. The operational conclusion had not been reached. The announcements resumed. And then the sharper escalation. April 2026. Mehdi Farid, former employee of the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran. The judiciary's account shared organizational structures, security arrangements, infrastructure data, connected internal servers to infected files, enabled outside access via USB devices, confessed during the case process. Initially sentenced to 10 years. Prosecutor objected. Sentence changed to death. Hengaw's account, approached by Israeli-linked individuals, asked to act against nuclear scientists, refused, voluntarily reported the approach to the security office of the Atomic Energy Agency, handed over the information and payments he had received. The two accounts share one fact: Mehdi Farid had contact with individuals attributed to Israeli intelligence. Everything else about the meaning of that contact, whether it constituted espionage or resistance, whether his subsequent actions were those of a spy or a loyal employee who reported a recruitment attempt, is irreconcilably disputed. The prosecutor who objected to the 10-year sentence was not engaging with that dispute. The system that elevated the sentence to death was not designed to engage with it. The Supreme Court that upheld the sentence had before it a confession and a charge, and a procedural record that had been completed according to its own internal requirements. Legal procedures had been completed. Farid was executed in April 2026. The announcement came from Mizan. 4 sentences. The same passive voice. The same closing phrase. By that point, the investigation had been running for 10 months. It had produced at least 17 executions on espionage-related charges. It had arrested more than 700 people in total. It had generated a public record of sequential, named, announced convictions that Iran's leadership could point to as evidence that the state had responded to June 13 with capability and resolve. What it had not generated, what the method it used made it structurally incapable of generating, was an answer to the question that had been present since the first announcement on June 16, 2025. The network that had produced the targeting precision of June 13 had an operational core. That core had survived the 2011 and 2012 arrests. It had survived the years between. It had survived long enough to build something that killed 30 generals and scientists in 12 days. 10 months of post-war executions had not named it, had not reached it, had not announced its dismantling in 4 sentences or 40. The machine had been running at full capacity. The machine had been producing. And the thing it was supposed to find was not in any of the files it had closed. The fallout did not wait for the investigation to conclude. It began accumulating while the announcements were still coming. The first consequence was institutional, and it was felt not in Tehran, but in every foreign intelligence service that was paying attention. The post-June crackdown had demonstrated something that professional counterintelligence communities register with quiet precision: that Iran's response to a catastrophic intelligence failure was to operate at maximum speed with minimum evidentiary standard, under conditions that guaranteed a high rate of false positives, and to announce each conviction publicly before any external verification was possible. That observation cut in 2 directions simultaneously. For anyone genuinely working inside Iran on behalf of a foreign service, the executions were a warning of exactly the kind Iran intended. The message was received. The cost of exposure had been made visible, one name at a time, across 12 months of Monday morning announcements. But for the operational core of a network sophisticated enough to have built what enabled June 13, the crackdown offered something else. It offered confirmation that the investigation had not reached them. Every execution of a peripheral asset, every announcement that legal procedures had been completed, was also an announcement that this particular file was closed. The investigation had moved on. The trail that might have led somewhere had been formally concluded. A counterintelligence operation that publicly announces its own completions tells the surviving network exactly what it has not found. The second consequence was domestic, and it is visible in the documented experience of the families left behind. Javad Naimi was buried at Beheshti Masuma Cemetery in Qom under heavy security. His family had been warned before the burial. They said nothing publicly. The warning had been sufficient. Whether they believed the accusations against him or disbelieved them, or had simply understood that belief was no longer a category the state would permit them to act on, the record cannot determine. What the record confirms is that the warning worked. Their silence was produced. Their grief became invisible. Ruzbevadi's relatives spoke to Iran International. That decision, to give an account of a family member executed as an Israeli spy to a foreign outlet, was not a neutral act inside Iran in the autumn of 2025. The relatives said Vadi had confessed only after severe torture and threats made against his mother. If that account is accurate, then Vadi's mother knew, in the weeks before his execution, that her name had been used as a tool in an interrogation room. That her existence had been the mechanism of her son's breaking. She lived with that knowledge after he was gone. The record does not contain her account. The record contains only the relatives given at personal risk to a foreign journalist, because the alternative was the silence that had swallowed everyone else. Akhil Keshavarza's family went to Urmia Central Prison for a final visit the day before his execution. They knew it was the last time. The student organizations and human rights groups issuing warnings had made the timeline visible from the outside. The family went anyway. They said goodbye in whatever way a family says goodbye in that room under those circumstances. The next morning, Mossad announced that legal procedures had been completed. His execution produced condemnation on social media. It produced statements from human rights organizations. It produced nothing from the judiciary in response to the torture allegations. The condemnation passed. The rhythm of announcements continued. And then there is the payoff from Phase 4. The thread that began with Dariush Razainajad's wife running after a motorcycle on an ordinary afternoon in Tehran in 2011, and Feridun Abbasi surviving the bomb that was meant to kill him, and the 15 years of Iranian counterintelligence work that followed and was not sufficient. The payoff is this. The 2025 crackdown was not a new response to a new failure. It was the same response to the same failure, scaled up, accelerated, and stripped of whatever evidentiary patience the 2011 and 2012 investigations had briefly maintained. The earlier arrests caught some real assets and announced the dismantling of a network that had not been dismantled. The 2025 arrests caught more people, announced a larger dismantling, and left the same structural problem untouched. Feridun Abbasi survived the covert war. He died in the open one. The scientists and generals who died on June 13 had been protected by a security apparatus that had, in its own institutional assessment, already solved the infiltration problem in 2011 and 2012. That assessment was wrong. And the 2025 crackdown was built on the same institutional architecture, the same assumption that finding and executing the visible constituted addressing the invisible that had produced the wrong assessment the first time. The doctrinal consequence of that repetition is not something Iran's official statements acknowledge, but it is visible in the behavior of the investigation itself. The post-June crackdown did not develop new methods for reaching the operational core of a compartmentalized network. It applied the existing methods, digital surveillance, device forensics, interrogation, confession, at greater speed and greater scale. It produced greater output. It did not produce qualitatively different results. What it produced, at its documented human cost, across 12 months of 4-sentence announcements, was a record. A record of names, charges, convictions, and executions. A record that Iran's leadership could present as evidence of institutional competence and decisive response. A record that served the political function it was designed to serve. And here, stated for the last time, is what that record cannot be. A system that cannot distinguish between the asset and the man who refused to become one has not dismantled a network. It has demonstrated its own limitations at the price of lives it cannot return, in the service of a conclusion it cannot honestly claim. Mehdi Farid is the thesis made human. If the account documented by Hengaw is accurate, if he was an IT professional who was approached, refused, and reported the approach to his own government, then his execution is not an edge case or an anomaly. It is the logical endpoint of a method that uses confession as its central evidentiary event and political mandate as its operational clock. A system running at that speed, with those tools under that pressure, will eventually execute a man for the thing the system was supposedly designed to prevent. It will execute a man for resistance. The judiciary announced his execution in April 2026. Mizan published 4 sentences. Legal procedures had been completed. There was no 5th sentence. The question that Iran's post-June crackdown was designed to answer, who enabled June 13, and have they been found, remains, by any honest evidentiary standard, unanswered. What has been answered is a different question. What does a state do with an institutional failure too large to absorb and too visible to deny? It produces a record. It makes the record public. It formats the record in 4 sentences and repeats it until the repetition itself becomes the answer. The network that built what killed 30 commanders and scientists in 12 days had been running for at least 15 years. It had survived the motorcycle campaign. It had survived the 2011 and 2012 arrests. It had survived long enough and remained invisible enough to produce June 13. 10 months of post-war executions have not produced the name of a handler, have not produced the name of a station chief, have not produced an account of how the targeting intelligence was collected, analyzed, and transmitted. Have not reached the architecture. What they have produced is 17 names on Mossad. 17 families who were warned, or silenced, or left to speak at personal risk to foreign journalists because the silence had become unbearable. The ceasefire was declared on June 24, 2025. The crackdown that followed it continued through April 2026 and showed no structural signs of conclusion. Each announcement formatted identically, each closing the same way. If this investigation raised questions you want to pursue further, subscribing to the channel supports the research and verification work that every Hidden Ops script is built on. Every claim in this documentary is sourced. Every name was publicly documented before it appeared here. The next episode examines another operation, where the gap between what was announced and what actually happened took years to become visible, and cost more than the people who made the decision ever acknowledged.